everyone, and welcome. My name is Ryan Darby. I'm the president of the San Diego chapter of the Federalist Society. And thank you, everyone, for coming to our important and insightful presentation on California's water crisis. We've got a very good panel of experts right here. And I'd also really like to thank the California Western Student Chapter of the Federalist Society and President Dominique Boley for hosting us. Thank you for that. So we've got a lot of important stuff to talk about right here, so I'd like to go ahead and introduce our moderator. Dan McSwain is the San Diego Union Tribune's business columnist with 15 years of experience in San Diego County as a journalist. He has been recognized nationally for his investigative reporting and was nominated by the North County Times for a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on California's 2000 and 2001 power crisis. He's been a co-founder and manager of several technology companies which were later sold to publicly held corporations. Please welcome our moderator, Dan McSwain.
Thanks, Ryan. I'd like to thank you for inviting me and the rest of us, along with Adam Van Susteren, who I guess put this together. And is Dominique here?
I'm here.
All right. Thanks, Dominique.
Thank you for coming.
Sure. I'm probably the token libertarian kook on the panel, and an about water miser. Gary knows this about me. I ripped out all the water-thirsty plants on a 2.5-acre parcel in Valley Center a few years ago and put in native plants. I've lately killed my lawn in Oceanside, and I've been thinking about water policy for a long time. And one thing that occurs to me as I moderate this panel is that I generally don't like when people tell me what to do. And it occurs to me that earlier this year, the governor told all of us to use less water. And I was doing that already, so I was worried about whether I was going to have to dig even deeper. And some of that's still being sorted out. But how we came to this pass, what we do now, and what's coming down the road is as good as any theme, given that we're in a drought emergency in California that may or may not go away this winter if El Nino kicks in. So we have just an extremely distinguished panel to talk about this. Let's see, in order of the table here, we have Professor Jack Minen. He is a professor of law at the University of San Diego, where he teaches property, land use, planning, and water law. He's widely published, author or co-author of 8 books and various journal publications. He also has a broad background in government and industry, as well as academia. He was appointed by Governor Gray Davis to the California Regional Water Quality Control Board, which controls stormwater runoff and other important issues here in the Southern California region. And he chaired that board for 6 years. To his right is, he's also on the served on the Board of Governors of the Southern California Wetlands Recovery Project and the San Diego River Conservancy. We also have, to his right, Scott Slater. Attorney Scott Slater is chair of the National Resources Department at Brownstein, Hyatt, Farber, Schreck. He's based in Los Angeles and Santa Barbara. It's hard to think of a major water transaction or agreement that he hasn't been involved in over the last 20 years or so. One of my favorites, especially now, was the Quantification Settlement Agreement, which was the largest water transfer in U.S. history, and that makes 277,000 acre-feet of water available to good old San Diego County each year. And to his right, we have Gary Arandt. He is the general manager of the Valley Center Municipal Water District. He's been a water manager since the early 1970s. He is an admitted water buffalo. Gary is concerned that in times of drought and shortage, there always seems to be a tendency to focus on challenging the existing water rights system and examining how to best reallocate water to suit modern society. We would rather see the same energy focused on developing more water so that water rights and reallocation was not the focus. And finally, to his right, we have Daniel Brunton. He is our environmental law specialist. He focuses on environmental law for Latham and Watkins here in San Diego. He's also an expert on the California Environmental Quality Act, which is either the greatest innovation or catastrophe for public policy in our lifetimes, depending on your point of view. Mr. Brunton has defended 20 CEQA suits. His entitlement practice focuses on large-scale infrastructure projects, renewable energy, including renewable energy, transmission lines, stadiums, hot topic these days, rail and highway projects. So let's give a warm welcome to our panel, please. Just by way of introduction, I have, for years off and on, people have asked me, because I'm affiliated with the newspaper, people think I know something. It's a fundamental mistake in most cases. But when they ask me about water, I usually puckishly respond with, we have plenty of water. What are you talking about? None of my neighbors are allowing gasoline to flow down the street in their curbs at 5 o'clock in the morning. So that tells me, because they do that with water, that it's either mispriced or we have plenty of it, or both, probably both. So I've felt for some time that we did have an allocation problem and maybe a pricing problem. But then again, water is generally not distributed in a true market. It is a public right, a public good, and essentially a cost-based recovery system. So now that is on the verge of letting us down, this raises a lot of issues about water rights, allocation, what sort of market mechanisms can be imposed to get us to use less of it and do it voluntarily without the water police coming door to door. And there's really no bigger issue. Some of the people who look out in the future predict major wars over water. There's arguably been a couple already. San Diego appears to be ahead of the rest of California in establishing a secure water supply. So given those points of interest, and let's start with Professor Moynihan. Oh, and we do have a hard stop at 1 o'clock, so if everybody could keep the presentation parts to 5 or 10 minutes, that'll give us enough time for questions, I hope.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I thought what I'd do this afternoon is to talk about the causes for the water crisis, and then a few comments about the solutions that may be present in the offing. The topic is California's water crisis, but I think it's important and perhaps underappreciated that in the San Diego region, for example, we greatly rely on the Colorado River for our water supply. Current figures are about 65% of the water in Southern California in our region is sourced from the Colorado River. Now, why that is important is that the Colorado River is overstressed, it is over-allocated. Lake Mead is in threat of not being able to provide water delivery, and therefore the crisis extends more broadly than just California. It includes the entire Mountain West area. One of the causes for the crisis is evaporation. Scientific figures indicate that the evaporation from Lake Mead may be 10% a year. So evaporation is a serious problem. When you combine that with what I will refer to as climate change, I know that there are some people who dispute that there is such a thing as climate change, but clearly heat records indicate that temperatures are increasing, and therefore it's inevitable that we're going to have greater evaporation in our transportation systems for the delivery of water. So you have to broadly think about the problem. It's not only a Southern California or a California problem, it's a Western problem. I suppose, unfortunately for South Carolina and the East Coast at the present time, they've got more water. We'd like to have that problem, but not to the degree that they're suffering. Another consideration is there's a lot of discussion in the paper about El Nino and how it's going to affect our situation. It's important to appreciate that it's not simply rainfall that is important to the delivery of water, but it's snowpack. You have to have the snowpack because historically California has relied on the slow release of the snowpack so as to provide a continuous supply of water. Recently we've had difficulty with any snowpack in the Sierra. So therefore, when you talk about El Nino being a savior to our water crisis, you have to think about whether or not that water is primarily delivered, or precipitation is primarily delivered in Southern California, or whether it's all across the state, in particularly whether or not we can have a sufficient amount of snowpack. Another consideration behind the crisis is population growth. Some years ago, figures demonstrated that most of the way in which California met its population growth with regards to water supplies was through conservation. Well, conservation is a great technique. We ought to do more of it. Our per capita consumption is, based on global comparison figures, is still quite high. So there's a lot to be said for conservation. However, the problem with conservation is that it's like a sponge. You can only rake so much out of the sponge, at which point you can't bring any more out of conservation. That's not an argument in favor that we can't do more. It's just, I think, an appreciation that there are limits to using conservation as a method to meet increased needs. Overexploitation of groundwater is a serious problem for those of you who've been following what's going on in the Central Valley. There's huge swaths of the Central Valley that is subsidence. The land is sinking along the coast. We have, as a result of exploitation of groundwater, we have seawater intrusion in areas that were formerly potable water sources of supply. Now, the governor, as you may know, recently attempted to deal with groundwater management through signing legislation. It'll be yet to be proven whether or not that's going to be a significant method for trying to manage groundwater exploitation. But clearly, groundwater exploitation has been a source of water for farmers in the Central Valley who are meeting increased pressure from price increases. Water prices for agricultural interests have skyrocketed recently, although many will argue that they're still disproportionately out of whack with regards to other urban water users. So those are a couple of reasons why we have this problem. Low rainfall, poor snowpack, increased demand by population growth, overexploitation of groundwater resources, and I think most important for our region, the increased stress on the Colorado River that portends future difficulty. So what are the solutions? one solution is to go where the water is, and agriculture is typically said to have 80% of the developed water supplies. The critical question there is trying to figure out what are the best crops to grow in the state of California. And that's a difficult policy question that bumps up against legal issues with regards to water rights, water entitlement, libertarian notions, and what have you. But clearly that is an important policy question that has to be solved. Another important question is additional infrastructure. Much of the stormwater runoff simply runs to the ocean unused, and we need to do a better job in the state of capturing that stormwater in order to provide a additional source of supply. It's complicated because, as you probably know, first flushes of stormwater are heavily induced with various pollutants and so forth. That's why you see notices after heavy rainfalls about surfing, don't delve into the water and so forth. But it is an important source of water. We need to have better infrastructure to capture that resource. Recycled water, it's very unfortunate that we do not use recycled water. We have a recycled water facility on 52 that results in large amounts of recycled water being pumped back into the ocean after it's been reclaimed. That's a story that is best understood by understanding a complex set of litigation. In any event, we need better infrastructure with regards to the delivery of recycled water. You just, unfortunately, you don't just recycle the water. If you're going to use it as meeting potable water standards, you have to have a delivery system to get the recycled water to the point of use. Of course, from the lawyer's perspective, the conflict between farmers and land use owners, property owners, and the Endangered Species Act is an important, insoluble problem. Congress doesn't seem to be able to get its grips on the question. The important thing about the Endangered Species Act is it's pretty absolute. The protections are pretty absolute. There's not a lot of room to maneuver with regards to once you have an endangered species or a threatened species. Our moderator mentioned the issue of economic pricing of water. I did an interview for the Union Tribune some months ago in which I staked out the argument that one of the really serious problems is the vast disparity with regards to the pricing of water. And more attention has to be given so that the real cost of water is borne by the users. So those are a few thoughts that I have about the causes and solutions. I'm reminded of Alice Roosevelt, who was Teddy Roosevelt's daughter. She had a quip, which I think is appropriate. She said, if you don't have anything nice to say about someone, sit next to me at dinner.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm Scott Slater, and I'm just delighted to be here. I love the intro, so number one, I want to be relevant for you and quickly sort of identify three things that I think are going to be emerging. You're all lawyers, I assume. We're going to be lawyers. So, and by the way, I want to say, first thing, be passionate and write when you have that opportunity. You may not think that your law review notes and your articles get read. They do get read. They do matter. You have an opportunity right now to have great influence on those of us in the trenches trying to do things by being able to cite to passionate, well-argued, well-reasoned notes, comments. Very appreciated. So I want to talk about three things that are in the context of what we're dealing with, and then I want to talk about the background of law policy and economics which drive what happens in a scarce resource policy. So great segue. The first thing is what we're really talking about in a construct is what is baseline. We're talking about what is baseline because it is a driver for future decision making. We need to know what we have in order to plan for what we need to do. If we don't know what we have because the baseline is variable and unpredictable, it becomes very difficult to make investments into the future on the basis of what we know. So baseline. Baseline becomes really important in the water context because it drives questions of allocation. Who gets what when in times of shortage? There's an interesting fact that in the last time we had a really dramatic drought, no, not in the 90s, but 1976-77, when all hell broke loose in Northern California. But guess what? The Colorado River was performing, and everybody down in Southern California was pretty much okay. Up in Northern California, people didn't have enough water for showers. So the governor then, Governor Brown, called together all the state's experts and convened a governor's commission to review California water rights law. And guess what came out of that in the final governor's report? We need greater efficiency. We need a baseline. We need to determine what our rights are, and we need to eliminate uncertainty from our water law. That was the prime directive. So then they went to the legislature. They tried to get some things enacted, largely unsuccessful. But he had some friends in the Supreme Court. And they systematically went through the recommendations from the Governor's Commission in '78 and began to implement those in the form of law, consistently, systematically eliminating uncertainty from our water rights law. That's in one pathway. But we have another pathway that's going on at the same time. And what is that? That is the environmental movement. And what is the environmental movement doing? It's pushing CEQA and forward thinking in our analysis of information, one. Two, the public trust doctrine emerges, leaps forward out in 1983, which is anathema to certainty. It says that regardless of what you've done in the past, the government has the right to revisit the underlying circumstances and redo old decisions about how we allocate water. Then there's the imposition of the Endangered Species Act, which is the nuclear bomb in terms of baseline, because even if you've been doing something in the past and you take an endangered species, guess what? You have to stop. So now we have a water policy which is lurching forward, trying to promote transfers, reallocation, voluntary, consistent with the libertarian perspective, and it is being challenged at its core by a policy which is driving versatility in baseline. Right? Okay, so that's the first thing to keep an eye on. The second thing that's, in my estimation, really big is we're watching the battle for conveyance. Whether there's two elements to this. There's a lot of pressure. We got to do storage. We got to do storage. We got to do storage. Friends, you can have all the storage facilities you want. If you can't get it from point A to point B, it's a bigger problem. And my view is we got spots to tuck water beneath the ground surface. I know there are a lot of people who want to build grand reservoirs, but the groundwater aquifer system is perfectly fine. There's a great guy named Greg Thomas who works for the Natural Heritage Institute, an environmental think tank up in the central hour in San Francisco. And his big point is, let's operate our groundwater aquifer system in a manner that allows us to sink water. The key issue is how are you going to get it there and how are you going to get it out? We're constrained in our infrastructure, point one. Point two, we don't allow the private sector to participate. We only have public infrastructure. There is no private analog to public conveyance. Imagine that. Think about the oil and gas. Think about energy and our ability to move other resources, vast distances, efficiently. We need a private analog. So that's the next thing. And then there's an element which has to do with pricing as well. How are we going to price this? We have lots of different interpretations about what that ought to be. I think the next battleground is going to be in groundwater. The professor mentioned the notion that Governor Brown came forward and we had a Surface Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. Well, the challenge in implementing that act is here's what it does. It takes all of those historical water rights, which have been around for in this state over 100 years, and it jeopardizes those rights to bureaucratic discretion. So now everybody who has a water right, historically, instead of relying on the contours of that property right and being able to go to court and have it determined, now has to risk bureaucratic vagaries in how the bureaucracy will decide to allocate water in the same manner, perhaps, as the city of San Diego does in a rationing ordinance. And where do we start? What is baseline? What happened to priority? Whether property rights. Okay, so in that area, I think, and behind that, I think we've got a couple of things going on. Very important. First, I call this the ag-urban conversion, or inversion, sorry. The ag-urban inversion. And that is the notion, Professor mentioned, what are we going to grow and where? Well, economics in land, types of land, and available water have changed that dialogue. We are not the Midwest, and the state is not the Imperial Valley. If you've not seen the shift to vineyards first, walnuts, pistachios, and almonds, you are missing what the new paradigm. Ag was always the bottom of the food chain. Could always afford only to pay the least value for the water. Could not afford lawyers, guns, and money. That is no longer true. Private equity, big money, big farms are invested in those extremely profitable enterprises. They are outbidding urban uses for water. Last year we saw the Montecito Water District. If you don't know what Montecito is one of the more privileged, it's Rancho Santa Fe, of the Central Coast. Right? They were outbid by nut farmers for water in the Central Valley. That is a paradigm shift. And then last, I point out to you that the politics of the way things occur in California is where people vote. Southern Californians don't vote. People in Northern California vote. People in the Bay Area vote. And if you look at what happens at the ballot box, the driver is an appeal to those people who vote. And it is interesting as we look at how the policy will be implemented over the next 10 years, whether Southern Californians wake up and perhaps take a stronger interest in voting in their self-interest. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Gary Arantz, and as I said, I'm a water manager from North County. What am I doing here? I'm not an attorney, though I do stipulate to what most of those two said. And you heard my opening comments, so I'll skip those. I won't repeat them. So I focused on water rights and the issues of water rights. And if you read publications today, there's a lot of discussion about maybe we need to rethink water rights in California and reinvent a new system of water rights. Appropriate water rights come under a lot of questions. Probably a really great example of appropriation was in 1901 when the city of San Diego appropriated water, the city of San Francisco appropriated water for the Hetchetchee project off the Tuolumne River by going out and posting a notice of appropriation on a tree next to the river without notifying the Modesto Irrigation District that they were doing that, which led to a long-term fight, which San Francisco ultimately won. And the Hetchetchee project was built, though there is still controversy about that project today. There are many, many cases of appropriative water rights being established prior to 1914. 1914 was the year that the state of California, through the Water Commission Act of 1913, had governance over appropriate water rights, allocating water rights. And in the articles I read today, there's a lot of discussion about, given some of the things that Scott talked about and Dr. Minor talked about, is that the question is, were appropriate water rights taken at a time when California had an unending water supply, and those in the 1850s or 60s could never envision what California would be today? Is it time to unravel that and unwind that and find a more modern way to allocate water rights within California to meet more modern water rights needs? It could be argued that those rights are allocated just upon first in time, first in right. You post a notice of appropriation, but anybody doing an evaluation of whether or not you were going to put that water to a good use or priority use, and maybe it's time that we take a look at how that water is being utilized. Many of us believe that the market should determine that, but a lot of people are saying we need to really take a look at the societal, the highest and best use of that water for society. So I guess, and while we're at it, why don't we raise some other questions? The other prevalent form of water right is riparian. In other words, if you buy a piece of property that happens to have a river running by it or through it, you have a right to what's called usufructuary right to that water. And as you can use that water on the basis that you have a riparian right. Well, what's the basis for that? Maybe we should look at that one too while we're at it. Maybe we should look at throwing out all the old-fashioned sources of water rights law. Roman law, English law, customary right by appropriation, overlying rights, groundwater rights, as Scott talked about. And this is what makes a lot of us nervous, is in the place of that, we'll ask the state legislature or the State Water Resources Control Board to wrest all those water rights away from the property owners and then reallocate them based upon their perception of the highest and best needs of those water rights. Now, you as potential attorneys should be smiling at that prospect, because that would put all of you through to your retirement and your children through lawsuit. Just, right, Scott?
Yeah, New England our firm.
But in California and in the United States, at least so far, water rights are regarded as property rights. So you can't just take property rights away from people without compensation. So you can imagine that undoing the water rights structure in California would be a very extensive and expensive process. It'd take a long, long time to do that. And while you're also thinking about that, let's think about the other things that historically have been claimed by a similar process as appropriation, such as planting a flag and saying, this is New Spain, or making a pile of rocks and saying, this is my land claim, or we have guns and armor and you don't. There's been a lot of natural resources that have been appropriated like that, and that's almost a similar fashion to appropriating water rights. And, you know, some of the issues of water rights and land ownership are all based on no less shaky legal grounds than water rights in some people's minds. So what I would recommend in the alternative is that water rights issues are important, but also California has gone about ignoring its water system since the early 1970s. In other words, the State Water Project was completed in 1973. The state of California has essentially done nothing to expand the storage capacity, the conveyance capacity, or reliability of that project. Largely, the state has been carried forward on the backs of regional development, such as what's gone on here in San Diego with the water transfer, canal lining project that's conserved about 80,000 acre-feet of water, and soon a desal plant that comes online. And there have been other regional efforts in Orange County and Los Angeles County to enhance regional water supplies. And it's a fortunate thing because right now in a drought situation, San Diego and Southern California largely are being protected from the impacts of the drought because of these regional water supplies. But the state of California, essentially the system, the State Water Project, has been the same since 1973. And nothing has happened. So I would propose as an alternative, rather than to drag us through a total redo of our water rights law, is that maybe we refocus our efforts on taking care of the water system and developing a more reliable and ample water supply for the state's future. So that's my point of view.
Okay, that's a perfect segue into my modest and hopefully provocative proposal for California to look at new source of water, specifically out-of-state water. Just a couple slides on the background. It's been alluded to before. We have a very variable water supply because of the environment and the vagaries of climate and how much it rains. Much of it is already allocated. A lot of it goes to environmental, roughly half, 40% to agriculture. Only 10% is urban, roughly. So when we're talking about not watering our lawns or not ordering water at restaurants, we're working on that small sliver, the 10% that's urban water. How bad is the drought? It's really bad right now. It's been part of a longer-term 16-year drought in the western United States. Some sources suggest that there could be a non-trivial probability of a multi-decade mega drought. We'll see soon whether the El Nino brings some much-needed rains. What we do know, though, is that droughts are a recurring event. Scott alluded to earlier, and Gary mentioned that the droughts in the 70s, they go all the way back, the recorded history and pre-recorded history. We know that droughts will return in California. I was talking to Professor Myman beforehand, before the talk briefly, that I almost wish that the drought would carry on a few more years because people have such short memories and forget about the need for investment in our infrastructure as soon as it rains. But we know whether it rains this winter or not, the drought will return, and California has a need for water. It's remarkable what we've been able to accomplish with conservation. Desal certainly is going to be an important part of the mix, water reuse. But I do think that we have not just a misallocation of water, but we need more of it. We have farmland lying fallow, subsidence in the Central Valley as people are pumping to get the groundwater. Here in San Diego, I know some farmers are ripping out their avocado groves because the water is too expensive. So I think we need a new water supply. And my hopefully somewhat provocative proposal is to look north to the Columbia River. William Shatner, of all people, Captain Spock, had a proposal. You may have seen it. It was in
Captain Kirk.
Yeah, Captain Kirk, sorry. Captain Kirk had a proposal, Kickstarter. He was going to have a $30 billion project with a Kickstarter. I don't know if you get a free T-shirt or a bottle of Captain Kirk bottled water or something if you donate, but to bring a tunnel, overland tunnel from Seattle, where he said they have plenty of water. It rains all the time there, to California that needs it. That particular iteration of the idea seems a little bit whimsical, but smart people are thinking about this idea. April 2014, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory at Caltech, affiliated with NASA, released a study looking at bringing a Kevlar reinforced fiber pipe from the mouth of the Columbia River along the sea shelf from Washington to past Oregon down to California, bringing it into Lake Shasta. And their estimate, this was completely back of the envelope, but using a Kevlar reinforced pipe, much cheaper than using a steel pipe. Their very rough estimate was $2.4 billion. And this has been done before with other technologies, certainly underwater pipes in other areas. We're talking, too, about a tiny sliver of the Columbia River. The Colorado River has been mentioned. It is much less than the nearly 200 million acre feet that the Columbia River flows out to the Pacific Ocean every year. And not a drop of it reaches the ocean. It's fully taken, appropriated, diverted. The Columbia River, in contrast, it's nearly 200 million acre feet, roughly 190. This tiny sliver of green, 8 million acre feet, is what's diverted currently. The proposal would be to take about 1.5% roughly and divert that to California using this pipe. The smarties at NASA are looking at it. Congress is taking an interest too. Earlier in September, House Resolution 3529 was introduced requiring NASA to do a feasibility study on this proposal. The initial study was really just a concept that they were looking at to look at whether these new materials and some of the satellite bathymetry images that they've gotten could be used to make a viable project. But this would take it a step further and require NASA to do a full feasibility study. look at the environmental impacts, the cost, the technical feasibility. Certainly there would be, some environmental impacts. If nothing else, it has to come above the water at some point, and people are going to see it, and some people think that that's an impact. But I also think there's a real potential for an overall environmentally beneficial project. There are tremendous stresses on the Bay Delta right now. The Endangered Species Act, I don't think it's going to go away. Those constraints are real and are going to remain real for our lifetimes. The political and legal constraints on us getting more water from the Bay Delta. Introducing a new source of water could relieve some of those pressures, possibly relieve some of the pressures of pumping groundwater in the Central Valley. Who knows, maybe even provide a partial solution to some of the troubles with the Salton Sea. So my hope is that Congress will direct NASA to further study this. And I think whether it's this project or another project, California does need to be looking, as the other panelists alluded to, at new sources of water.
Thank you. Well, that's spectacular. I covered a lot of ground. I had trouble keeping up. Questions?
Yes, I'd like to ask you from a water manager's perspective, what is the most burdensome part of complying with Proposition 218 that your agency faces?
Well, let me just speak in perspectives from many water agencies. My water agency has a flat rate, so we think Prop 218 is great, and I'm even off to conduct rate-making classes on using simple math to create your water rates.
Gary, can you define Prop 218 just for the uninitiated?
Prop 218 was a ballot proposition modifying the state constitution, which essentially said that whatever you charge for a service, if you're a government agency, there has to be an excess between what it actually costs to provide that service. The issue with water rates and water agencies is many water agencies have adopted inclining block rates for the purpose of modifying water use. In other words, the more you use, the more it costs. And they've been very effective, except that most of them are struggling now to find a nexus between a higher rate block and actual cost, because many of us have a single price supply. So it becomes magic math, if you will, in trying to come up with that relationship. So the San Juan case, which was not depublished and is out there now, is leading to some political and legal headaches for retail water agencies.
Is there any other part, just follow up, that your agency in particular has an issue with, doing whether it's mailing or notice?
Yeah, I have to mail out 50,000 notices. I have 50,000 parcels, and most of those are timeshare parcels at Lawrence Welks. Each week, it's a burden, and it doesn't allow you the flexibility to respond to situations like we have now, where in the first 4 months of the cutback program, we've lost $600,000 in net revenue, and it makes it very hard for us to adjust to that on a real-time basis.
Thanks.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I could never resist an opportunity to grill a former law professor of mine from USD, so my question's for Professor Lyman. Given your experience on the State Water Board, I'm curious, we have this great source of water to the west called the Pacific Ocean, and I know in Carlsbad there's a plant that's going to open, I think pretty soon here, that's going to take that water and remove the salt and purify it for use. Why are we not doing more of that in California? And I understand from at least one commentator, Roger Hedgecock, said there have been 12 to 13 years of permit battles to get that plant up and running in Carlsbad.
Well, I was a consultant on the desalinization project. A former student of mine is vice president in charge of that, so I'm familiar with it. So there are basically two environmental concerns. On the inflow side, entrainment of fish and larvae and so forth. And on the discharge side, because you get about 50% of the potable water as an output, it's a increased saline discharge. And the impact of that increased saline discharge in the ocean, objectors to the project will argue is detrimental to the environment. So those are two of the arguments. There is another argument about the increased energy that goes into the operation of these plants, and that produces increased carbon emissions, and that becomes also a difficult problem. So, as a practical matter, the environmental community sued, I think, 13 times, and they didn't win any of those cases, but the investors were left to hang to dry for 13 years, and it was amazing to me that they were able to maintain the course towards seeing that project through, because there's one thing you know if you've done any environmental work is that one of the strategies of some environmental claims is that if you keep the project proponents in court long enough, they'll give up for financial reasons. So that didn't happen. I have argued elsewhere that there ought to be a more simplified permitting process. The Coastal Commission was involved, the Lands Commission was involved, the Regional Board was involved, you've got some federal involvement and so forth. So there's a lot of complicated regulatory hurdles that you have to go through. So simplifying that process would move in the direction of increased use. But it's a bureaucratic struggle to get through the desalinization process. And I don't know whether that answers your question. I happen to be a proponent of increased use. I appreciate the fact that it is expensive. It's over $2,000 an acre foot, which is, expensive. But if you don't have any water, you can put to one side expense. So I would argue that we're not going to conserve our way out of the problem. We have to find new sources of water, and certainly desalinization is a new source of water.
If I may, that project was a pitched battle for a number of years. And I happen to know that the site invested well over $60 million in legal fees, expenses over a period of time. And they are now working on a plant in Orange County. There's a lot of buzz in the news about Israel. Let's look at what Israel's doing. Why they're doing such a great job. They're not doing anything that we can't do. It's just that they have an environment there where people are focused on. We want an adequate water supply. In this world, we have a group of entrenched and dedicated environmental groups who really don't want to see this happen for the environmental reasons, but in my personal view, it's an issue of growth. They feel that if we limit water supply, we're going to limit growth. That's absolutely false. And so that's the ongoing battle.
There was another consideration that I should mention, and that is the environmentalists were concerned that you would, because these desalination plants are co-located with energy facilities, the argument was that they would anchor an old technology, the power plants, the older power plants and so forth. So there was very serious concern about the relationship between energy production and desalinization.
One of the reasons that analysts give for the success of Israel in securing its supply is that a long time ago, all the way back to David Ben-Gurion, they socialized their water supply completely. You didn't own the water under the ground, you didn't own the river, the people of Israel did. I wonder if Mr. Slater, is that the model? Is that the model here, or my concern is we end up with a bifurcated private-public situation where we end up with the worst of both worlds, which arguably has occurred in parts of the energy economy.
Okay, so first of all, you're asking a capitalist. So I am but I'm schizophrenic because I am an environmentalist. I live in a beach community, and I love the ocean and love the environment I live in. But I also believe that capitalism provides some advantages, and one is innovation. I attended a recent Urban Water Institute presentation in which a sociologist studied the water industry gave his report about people in the water space and concluded that innovation was not being driven by people in the water profession, engineering and so on, largely because they are constrained by safety first. And it is a culture that grows up risk averse. So there is no reward. There is no reward in the water space for people to innovate. It's sort of the alter ego or the antithesis of innovation, and for good reason. The private sector is not that way. The private sector is capable of taking risks and innovating, and so that the mention was about the Poseidon project as an example where it took 16 years of R&D to perfect the product and bring it to fruition. That's all done with private dollars, and at the conclusion of that, the public gets to make its choice. Does it want to buy a finished product or not? The converse of that is to have the public agency make the investment and in many cases drill dry holes, pardon the pun, and flush that investment. So that's the first thing. The second thing is there really is no a private sector water. You have people who are trying to develop an asset, whether it be a farmer who's implementing conservation measures or venture capital trying to develop a resource. All distribution of water in the state is it's next to nuclear waste. It's the most heavily regulated substance on earth, and particularly in this state. I mean, you think about all the regulatory, long-winded here, but you got EPA, you got Division of Drinking Water, State Water Resources Control Board, the Regional Water Quality Control Board, the Department of Public Health, the Bureau of Reclamation, and go on and on and on. The Australians came to visit. Actually, I went to Australia once and lectured on this for a year. They view us as the Balkan states. I mean, they just cannot imagine having such fragmented regulation of water.
I have a question about the 50-40-10 pie chart. To give me a better understanding of what the 50 really means, the environmental 50%. Let's assume that all environmental laws disappeared and there was zero environmental political support in legislation. So all of that is removed. Does the 50% mean that we can just throw a switch and that 50%, some portion of that 50% immediately goes to farms and urban? Or does it mean, okay, now we have a right to build dams, which will take 6 years to build? And which is it, or in what proportion?
Look, we probably all have our points of view on that. So so I'll start with, you look at the pie chart. The pie chart is based upon, I think, if I understand it, maybe some person who prepared the chart that answer, but from all the charts that I've seen, the notion is regulatory requirements establish a baseline for fisheries and aquatic species. So that's what the number, that's what drives the number. And if there were a more efficient or better way or a better mousetrap to protect that baseline, then that number would move down. And the problem we have is it's not constant. It's climatically variable. So there are instances in which the quantity shifts.
Mine is more of an infrastructure question. Suppose they didn't care about the fisheries at all.
It would all be available. 100% would be available for distribution to some other beneficial use in accordance with the permitting authority of the state board.
How soon? Today or in 6 years when you build it?
In real world or hypothetical world?
Real world.
In real world, you are a long ways away from being able to do that because the water rights regime that is in existence has unmet claims. Gary was mentioning the appropriation system, and I was mentioning the drive for certainty. We have lots of paper water rights out there that are unmet, and those rights have a claim on the supply, so they're an empty glass that would be filled up.
One of the points I glossed over in my presentation, if you added up all the appropriate water rights in the state, they exceed the actual water available for appropriation by an order of magnitude of 4 or 5. If you added them all up. So there's not enough water to meet all the established water rights in the state.
Okay, are some of those water rights agriculture? Is that?
Oh, yes.
Okay. So effectively, if you got rid of the environmental entirely somehow, it would almost all flow into the agricultural rights.
No, floor in the courtroom.
Yeah, I don't think it all. I can say it all goes to ag. I just think that there's unmet claims.
Okay.
And probably a mix.
So they'd have a legal right.
So attorneys should invest in scuba gear, in other words. Ryan, how are we on time? I know Mr. Slater has to leave.
Yeah, I'm enjoying this, and I just postponed my meeting a little bit, so.
Oh, okay.
Okay?
If he was going to leave, I'd take over his questions.
So sure, time for more Q&A.
I wonder if we should talk about cost. Is there another question from the crowd?
I had a question about, in China, during the Olympics, they seeded the clouds to get rain. Any thought of trying to get that done instead of getting it out of the ocean, getting it out of the sky?
We do that. There's a DWR cloud seeding program that goes on, and believe it or not, there's even a code provision in the water code which says that cloud seeding doesn't generate any additional water rights. And so it's done, and it's accounted for.
An interesting sidelight on that is that there's a particular beetle that is in desert areas that is able to capture water from the air, moisture in the air. There are suggestions about fog capture systems as a means of generating water supply based on this little beetle that is able to sustain itself by capturing the moisture in the air. So whether or not that's far-fetched or not, there are actual proposals and explorations on that.
I was on, go ahead.
Just want to make a comment. The water reclamation sites in Israel, a lot of them are co-located because of the different types of technology that are used in order to in order to desalinate the water. So, for example, in Oceanside at the Poseidon plant, it's reverse osmosis, I think, is what's being used, which is very energy intensive, requires a lot of high pressure water, like 800 or 1,000 psi water, which is really serious stuff. Well, these co-located plants in Israel, they have waste heat which they use. And that changes the economics dramatically, because this waste heat, which would otherwise be going out into the Mediterranean, is used to promote the boiling of water. So there's reverse osmosis, we have boiling of water, there's lots of different ways of getting water desalinated. And depending upon which one to use, it depends upon the environment and situation that you're in. So they're able to do it in Israel because of that. Many times they have this co-location, they're able to use waste heat, and that's where it works for them. The other point I want to point out is that, and nobody mentioned it, I was out for a few minutes, maybe I missed that. Lockheed Martin's, they've invented carbon fibers that filter water. It filters salt from water. You're nodding your head. And how's that coming?
Well, I know. I don't know about Lockheed Martin in particular.
Was it Lockheed, or it was one of the aerospace companies?
I don't know about the aerospace company in particular, but in some of my work with JPL, I know that they're looking at graphene.
Yeah, graphene.
It would be years away, but it looks it could be extremely efficient if they could commercialize it. I think there's some big hurdles to getting that done, but they're very interested in it.
Israel comes up again. Right now, I think by 2017 or 2018, all coastal power plants have to cease operation. And in fact, the Encina power plant is going to be shutting down, and they're going to build a gas-fired dirt-cooled plant across the railroad tracks right next to it. So the idea of co-locating desal plants, I think it makes a lot of sense. Maybe co-locating desal plants next to nuclear power plants makes sense to me. I'm just a water buffalo. But what needs to be done is that technologically is pretty simple, really. And we have all the capabilities. I'll give you an example. On May 5th, the State Water Resources Control Board imposed the drought emergency regulations. Forced my agency to cut 36%, even though there's 98% of the water available in this county to meet all of our needs in Valley Center. That makes a lot of sense. I've tried to explain that to people. The next day, they adopted updates to the ocean plan, which made it significantly more difficult to build desal plants. So that's the challenge we face here in California, is that we don't have a unified approach or a focused approach on solving this problem.
Oh, I can't help it. But I have to say, there's an interesting phenomenon that's going on right now, which is that the governor issued his regulations requiring curtailment against water use, regardless of efficiency, regardless of any background. And there's been very little litigation to set it aside. There's been, I think the most prolific example is Riverside, which is a self-contained, fully sustainable city, and they were ordered to cut back 30% and 36%, which is, if you make the investment in sustainability, you cause no impact, you're not relying on any other external source, and you're obliged to cut back 36%, what's the rationale for doing that? And my law partners call that a turkey shoot. So it'll be interesting to see whether they can sustain this policy through February. The view is that it's going to be relaxed because of the El Nino, but if it's not, there will be trailing takings litigation for sure.
There will be litigation. There will be blood. Anybody graduating soon? Maybe you want to take us on for a walk?
Right. Please write.
I wonder if we could get into pricing theory just very briefly. There was the appellate court decision in San Juan Capistrano, correct? Most of my neighbors still have green lawns. Most of them have broken sprinkler heads, and we still grow rainforest crops like avocados in Valley Center, and we still grow alfalfa and rice in California, although those crops are rapidly diminishing this year. So should we have more aggressive conservation pricing? I know Prop 13 requires a demonstrable linkage to the actual cost. Is there an argument out there, and I will preface this with something I heard the former general manager of the Las Vegas Water District. She pointed out that 20% of all the energy consumption or power consumption in California goes to pumping water around the state. And she foresees an almost infinite price cycle of energies getting more expensive with renewable mandates and climate change mandates, and water becoming more and more expensive, and that the marginal cost of new supply of water is getting expensive for yet more reasons. Is there an opportunity for the legal community to argue successfully that you can have really aggressive conservation tiers because projected water supplies are going to be so expensive? Or is that just too hard to figure out?
Well, both of those topics you mentioned I call self-inflicted wounds. It doesn't have to be that way. It is that way because of the power structure in Sacramento and the way those people think. So a lot of those things could be changed. The other question is, when does conservation become deprivation? Or how far down do you want your standard of living to go? We know that right now our friends in Sacramento at the State Board are working on not so much extending the emergency regulations. They want to convert the emergency regulations into permanent water use standards. So you get to use 40 gallons a day per person or something like that. So tied to all these questions that Dan asked are economic impacts too. Because water and power drive the economics of the state. So I guess what we could do is just move everybody out of California, and then we wouldn't have any more of these problems. So the question becomes, how far do you want to become a third world state? Do you want living standards driven by environmental standards, how they think we should live? So a lot of us believe that we have the tools and capabilities to develop water resources. What we're developing today is much more diverse than it was when I first got in business when I was 10. And we can develop power, and we don't have to, live in the dark.
Yeah, I have to run here, but I had no idea that I was going to be sitting next to these people who were espousing these views, and it's a delight to be here. It's very refreshing. There is an economist. I was mentioning this. His name is David Sunny. He runs a PhD program at Berkeley, and what he always wants to remind people is there's a social cost of going without. So there are a lot of people whose perspective is that we ought to be able to live on less, and that's what we ought to do. And if you've not, there's a great piece, and I'll try to distribute it somehow to you, that was done by the Reason Foundation on the Center for Biological Diversity, and their thesis of deconstruction of civilization to drive millennials back to urban center and strangle suburbia by strangling infrastructure. But David's point is, there's a social justice cost to going without, because it's not just having less water to use in your house. It's the economic opportunity, it's the jobs that are foregone, it is the expansion of an economy and a growth opportunity is foregone because there's inadequate resources for that. And it's human misery. It's not just you don't have enough water or a shorter shower, it's human misery. So there's that point. And the second thing, which is sort of embedded, and people are often frustrated in Gary's position, if you're implementing a conservation program, you turn to your ordinary person and you say, please cut your water use by 36%, my water bill's going up by 70%. Because you have fixed costs, which are predicated upon distributing water over a number of customers, and all of a sudden the customer base is gone. And how do I cover those fixed costs? And people go insane. And I just say that perhaps there's an opportunity for the private sector and others to play a role in funding those conservation opportunities, leaky pipes and things, and getting a different return.
Got any jobs over there?
Thank you so much. What a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Should we go on, or should we end on that happy note of human misery?
Let's wrap it up pretty quickly.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Ryan, Dominique, and everybody in the audience. I've really enjoyed it, and I've learned a lot. I feel half a notebook.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's right. All right.